different native peoples that you've worked with over the years, and they've all talked to you about their lives, their traditions, and probably they've talked to you about the times in which we live. Many of them, I'm sure, are aware of the times in which we live. I had conversations with the Kero elders in the mid-90s where they were talking about the upturning of the universe, the universe getting turned inside out. But this would also be a time of great broadening of awareness of humanity. It would also be a very difficult time. It seems spot on the way things are moving right now. But you've worked with so many different peoples, and I'm sure that they've all had a strain of hope in their conversation with you. So maybe we can just do a bit of a move around the world here, and perhaps you could give us some advice from their elders. What kind of hope do they see, who are in an even more difficult situation, I think, than we are in right now, and see if we can help people out with some of their ancient cultural artifacts in their expression to you. Maybe the
thing that I notice so often is that indigenous people, when they become aware of these changes, they feel a personal responsibility, and this is one of the great tragedies. I mean, for example, when people in the Himalaya or in the Andes who believe the earth is alive, believe in mountain deities, if things go askew, they take it very personally. I mean, one of the most kind of poignant examples of that is what you experienced at the Coyariti. I mean, traditionally, of course, the Coyariti is this syncretic fusion of pre-Columbian and Catholic ideas, a perfect expression of this pan-Andean world, which is as influenced by Catholicism as it is by pre-Columbian Incaic and pre-Incaic ideas. But pilgrimage becomes a sacred movement to the ice, so that this wonderful metaphor of taking the crosses from your community, placing them into the tongues of the glacier that comes down over the Sinicara Valley, leaving them overnight to empower them that you can take it back to your community. But remember as well that traditionally you also brought chunks of ice back to your community, and they've stopped doing that because they're witnessing the recession of the glaciers, and they take it as their own personal responsibility and fault. And that's very moving, because of course the trivial amount of ice that was chipped from those glaciers and brought home as the essence of Pachamama to those who couldn't participate in the pilgrimage is trivial compared to what of course is really happening, is this recession of the glaciers. By the same token, I recently was returned to the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, where you have this extraordinary group of related peoples, the Wiwa, the Kohi, and the Arhuacos, all descendants of the Tairona civilization, which once carpeted the Caribbean coastal plain, all perceiving themselves as being the elder brothers, the ones responsible for the maintenance of the well-being of the world. And clearly in the wake of the conquest, they retreated into this isolated volcanic massif that soars to 20,000 feet over the coastal plain of Colombia. And in a kind of blood-stained continent, in many ways you could argue these people have never been fully conquered by the Spanish. I mean, they remain ruled by a ritual priesthood. And in fact, they've created or maintained or recreated a kind of Baroque religiosity, which is astonishing. I mean, some people feel that the religious view of the people of the Sierra is derived from the moment of the Holocaust at the time of contact. In other words, when the diseases swept through and the Spaniards unleashed their terror, it's like the people somehow retreated into the mountains and said, my God, we really blew it. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened to us. We'll never blow it again. We'll never forget the obligations we have to the Great Mother. But however this came about, to this day, living 2 hours from Miami Beach by modern jet, the people of the Sierra Nevada literally are praying for your well-being. I mean, they believe that their ritual activities and their literal prayers maintain the cosmic balance of the earth. They call themselves the Elder Brothers, charged with the obligation to maintain the heart of the world, which is the Sierra, and charged with the duty to inform us, the younger brother, of the foolishness of our ways. And I find this incredibly moving that so close to Miami and the eastern seaboard, 500 years after Columbus, is this remarkably intact tradition. A people for whom the loom is a metaphor of life. Upon this loom I weave my life. They respond, they describe their movements up and down the ecological flank of the gradient of the Sierra as threads. They plant fields so that the women plant it like this and the men plant it like this, so that if you turn it on its side you have a piece of cloth. Mm-hmm. They have a ritual training for the priesthood which is extraordinary in its intensity. The young acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3 and essentially kept in the environs of the men's sacred temple for 18 years. 2 9-year periods deliberately chosen to mimic the 9 months of gestation of their natural mother's womb. Now they're metaphorically in the womb of the Great Mother, and for that entire time the world in a sense only exists as an abstraction as they're taught the values of their society, values that maintain this amazing idea that their prayers maintain the cosmic balance. And then after this long period of initiation, the young priest-to-be is taken on pilgrimage from the sea to the ice to exchange materials from sea to ice, ice to sea. But during that time, he really sees the world as it is for the first time. And what has existed as only an abstraction is suddenly revealed in stunning beauty. And the priest effectively says to him, see, as I've told you all these years, it's yours to protect. You are the elder brother. And that's just an astonishing thing. And I've seen in a more tragic sense even, that look of incredulity on the faces of people like the Panan in the forests of Sarawak in Borneo. I remember, the Panan were one of the last truly nomadic peoples of the rainforests of Southeast Asia. And in the year of my birth, there were probably, 50 to 60,000 nomadic Panan living in a remarkable way of life. I mean, nomadic people, first of all, are an echo of what we all once were, as your film suggests, before the Neolithic Revolution, we were all wanderers on a pristine planet. Nomadic societies are profoundly different. How do you measure wealth in a society in which everything can be made from the forest, in which there are really no specialists, and in which ultimately, at least at some point in time, everything has to be carried on your back, so there's no incentive to create material collections? Well, the measure of wealth is consciously said to be the strength of social relations between people, because if those relations fray, everybody suffers. By the same token, in a nomadic society, sharing becomes an involuntary reflex, because you never know who will be the next to bring the food to the table, as it were. And I remember sitting in the edge of the forest with a very close friend of mine, Asik Nielik, and he was a hunter, and suddenly the moon appeared through this sort of clouded sky, and he looked up to the moon, and he looked to me, and he looked back to the moon, and he says, "Is it true your people really went there?" And I said, "Yeah, we did go there." And he said, "Well, what kind of canoe or transport did they have? How long did it take to get there? Mm-hmm. And is it true that you only brought back rock and dust?" Mm-hmm. And it was hard to explain to a man who kindled fire with flint a space program that had consumed the wealth of nations and catapulted a dozen men collectively, I don't know how many billion miles across space to the moon, and that they in fact only did bring back rock and dust, 828 pounds altogether. And yet there was this kind of look in Asik's face like, well, why did you do all that? And yet here you are in my forest, as we were, in the guise of Korean and Japanese and Chinese timber companies, literally cutting the life out from beneath the feet of these people. And he just couldn't understand it. I mean, why would you want to do this? why would you want the glare of the hot sun when you could have the comfort of the canopy of the forest? Why would you possibly want, to, rip into the heart of the planet with these roads that just muddy our rivers that you can't fish? I mean, he just couldn't believe it, that how people could be so stupid and so vain. And, it's the same thing when you go up to the high Arctic. I recently was in Qaanaaq in northwest Greenland, which is one of the most northern, most inhabited places on the planet. And, here you are, a remarkable people, the Inuit, who have had to endure so much, both in Greenland, but especially in polar Canada. They've had to endure within virtually a generation, because many of these communities were scarcely contacted until the Second World War. And they've had to endure the diseases, the missionaries, the culture of poverty, the residential schools, the imposition of new technologies, and and all that they've had to deal with. And yet still they remain strong. And you have gestures like the creation by Canada of Nunavut, the new territory, which is such an amazing sort of gesture of restitution on the part of a nation state. And in places like Qaanaaq, where the people really have discovered, in particularly there, a way of fusing the traditional and the modern. They live in nice houses, they have good clinics, they use cell phones, they've all got DVDs, they're all plugged into Denmark and European society, but they kept their dogs. They don't allow skidoos, snowmobiles, to be used in daily life, because they knew that the dogs represented the cultural pivot, and that as long as they continued to use dogs, the act of maintaining the dogs, training the dogs, hunting with the dogs, would essentially keep something of their essence, indeed all of their essence, alive into the 21st century. And so it's a remarkable example of perseverance and cultural survival, and yet now, having endured so much, they are suffering from something far beyond their capacity to control. Global climate change. The ice upon which all the marine life, mammal life in particular, depends, and therefore all humans depend, used to come in September and stay till the end of July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. So they've seen the entire kind of economic and ecological foundation of their hunting way of life. Literally, it's dissolved beneath them because of climate change. And so, again, you go out with these folks, and I remember, in particular, flying from Igloolik in a charter plane across Baffin Island with a friend of mine who was a hunter from Igloolik, who had taken his dog team up Ellesmere Island, across Baffin Island, up Ellesmere, and across over to Greenland to visit distant relatives. And as we flew across the Kane Basin between Ellesmere and northern Greenland, he looked out the plane and he just started to weep. He just couldn't believe how everything was melted, how he would never again be able to take his dogs and his sled across that route that people had traveled, and that he and his courage had traveled as recently as 20 years ago. And tears were just sort of coming down on his cheek as we looked out at this scene. And so wherever I've gone, the people are just, incredulous that we have allowed this to happen on the planet. And at the same time, they sometimes feel very helpless to do much about it.
Would you say that all of these people shared the Peruvian idea of Aini? Is that really fundamental to their belief system?
Like community?
That we have this reciprocal relationship with the living earth?
I think it, like all things, human cultures are complicated and they're different, and they express things in different ways. People's attitude towards landscape and nature changes, depending on the place. But I think that in general, it's fair to say, whereas some people have a very clear and conscious idea of the earth, some people just live within the earth, within the process of being on the earth, and these ideas are never forgotten but rarely spoken about. it's tricky when we speak of indigenous people, and we sort of either inadvertently still invoke the old canard of Rousseau and the noble savage as if the people are somehow genetically closer to the earth than we can be, or we invoke Henry David Thoreau and suggest that because of their sensitivity they're more contemplative than we could ever be. In a way, both ideas are almost silly in their simplicity. Indigenous people are just like any other people, confronted by the same challenges. And they have, however, through time and ritual, created a kind of traditional mystique of the earth that's based not on the idea of being self-consciously aware of your place on it, but in many ways a far more subtle intuition, and that is the idea, particularly exemplified in places like Australia, that the earth itself only exists because it's filtered through the human imagination. This is where it really comes from. In other words, you can't possibly, how do you possibly create an idea of an ability to destroy the planet if you lack the technology to do so? I mean, I remember living, for example, with the Guarani in eastern Ecuador, and a wonderful moment when a guy was chopping down, a great forest tree, taking enormous delight in doing so. And suddenly he burst into pride and he said, "And once I killed a jaguar just from me to you." And then he went back to chopping. And you could tell that cutting down the forest and killing jaguars were like the cat's meow to him. But of course, this was a man who, in his childhood, was of a people that still cut down the forest by pounding the cambial layer with stone axes. So, how would you expect the Guarani, for example, to develop an ethos of conservation when for all of their history they didn't have the tools to even begin to impact the natural world? So it changes culture to culture, but what I do see is that in ritual and in gesture, people are very often, living with this idea that they're not just close to the earth, they're intricately connected to the earth because the earth only exists because of the human imagination. That doesn't mean that people can't be capable of blindness. I mean, one of the great horrors of the world is the toxicity of the mother of Ganges, and how in modern times people are prepared to, in certain cases, become so obsessed with the sanctity of a site that the site remains sacred no matter how defiled it becomes by us, And certainly, one of the great tragedies, or one of the great horrors in Australia, is the living conditions of Aboriginal people who live in communities. I mean, those communities make almost the worst Canadian or American native reserve, dreadful as these places can be, in terms of social pathology and living conditions. And one of the great points of shame is the way that native people have been corralled into these places. But at any rate, the conditions in Australia are far worse, and there's a level of kind of degradation and living in a kind of squalor that is really demoralizing to the people, I think, and but so it's not, which obviously is part of the clash of culture there. But so it's not like people necessarily, and the kind of Thoreauian idea of native people almost becomes racist in its simplicity, because it implies that these people, quote unquote, these people, are fundamentally different than us. And in many ways, I would argue that in essence, human beings are remarkably similar. It's just that our worldview became a kind of extreme tangent of human possibilities, the consequences of which have been both sublime and catastrophic. And what we need to do is get a little bit more of the sublime and a little bit less of the catastrophic.
Are the plants helping us to do that? This whole movement of ayahuasca through the world with Santo Daime, the kind of shamanic revival in the West, I suppose. Well, is it helping?
Well, I'm someone who loves to be able to say that not only did I inhale, I enjoyed it. In other words, one of the things that I find so interesting about our generation is not that we became the most kind of self-referential and narcissistic in history, not to mention the most materialistic. That was certainly a surprise to me. But you know, when we look back on the recipe of social change that provokes some of these remarkable shifts, you know, the role of women, attitudes towards people of color, you know, the breakdown of racism, you know, attitudes towards the environment, you know, which are really quite extraordinary. The one ingredient that is consistently expunged from the record is the fact that millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having consumed some sacred plant. And I like to say that I don't honestly think that I would write the way I write, I would think the way I think. I don't think I would have the same appreciation of notions of cultural relativism that have obviously informed me as an anthropologist had I not taken San Pedro cactus or ayahuasca or you know, the psychotropic substances. I mean, you know, the big anti-drug people love to say, don't take these things, they're going to change your life. And they're right. And that's the point of taking them. You know, I mean, these things make you think in different ways. And, you know, it reminds me of when the Beatles broke and, you know, this friend of mine's father, you know, couldn't understand the whole thing. And he just sort of said to me in a rage one day, bet they can't catch a football. And I thought, well, maybe true. But when I heard the first notes of Day into Life, I thought, wow, here's what words can do. And that's why I became a writer. You know, so that this said, you know, I'm not in any way advocating people to take psychotropic plants, and I think you want to be very careful to remember that wonderful adage of I think it was Ram Dass who said, you know, get the message, hang up. I mean, you know, what psychotropic plants have to teach us, I think, frankly, can be learned in a few sessions, and then I don't think you learn a whole lot more. And I think they're, you know, pharmacologically they're incredibly benign, but psychologically they can be challenging. And I think that you know, it's an interesting thing where at a certain point in your life, it's very, when you're trying to deconstruct the universe, it's very useful to take these substances. But then when you start reconstructing your reality, sometimes they can be profoundly threatening. Now, you know, the idea that I think I'll stop in a sec. So I'll just wait till it. Actually, maybe just shut this.